which is a rarefied differentiation of light. It diffuses consciousness programmings encoded within that light as instructions for the dimensional behaviorisms of the DNA, the chromosomes, electrons, neutrons, quarks, muons, in essence, coordinating the macrocosmic intent of the infinite mind into microcosmic reality. Melanin delineates the characteristics of omniscient being into the corporeal characteristics of material becoming. Let me say that again. Melanin delineates the characteristics of omniscient being, gives you its intent, its personality, delineates omniscient being into the corporeal characteristics of material becoming. So without melanin, being could never become. Understand and overstand, melanin is not a color. To truly understand the divinity that is, quote unquote, melanin, or dark matter consciousness, or the Seshet Kem Ur, we must understand the metaphysics of form. Now, how does dark matter become form? Man, before anything was realized.
Sure.
Yeah,
I got you.
Before anything was realized of man, man was a proto-etheric seed of intent. A proto-etheric. In other words, it was the essential essence before the ether was created for man. It didn't just happen. It was part of the distillation process. That is imagined. The first 7 days of Genesis is how God imagined itself. In that process of involution, there was a realization. Now, you have never looked at this word and took the context to what it means. To realize. It should be realize. To make tangible. To bring into existence. The Most High, in the first 7 days, remember I told you that, what was that? Genesis was the story of the involutionary properties of the mind of God, and Exodus was the evolutionary properties. So you had the yin and the yang, the chit and the chaitanya, the diverse, the inward and the outward. So when you understood or understand that man is God folded over on itself, that they say to you that from the darkness came the light, but they did not tell you that the light had to seek the darkness again to realize itself. Because if you go from one polarity to the next, you lose context with the balance necessary. So in corporeal matter, the light that came from the darkness that was the ignorance of God, which returned factors as the evil that Lucifer came down to reveal. That light projecting from the darkness had to project back into darkness, so that dark matter had to solidate or consolidate itself into what we now recognize as man. So the only way for light to be used as a transportation system for consciousness growth means that it had to emulate the ignorance representative of the mind of God as perfection. And in that reflection, you now understand and understand that the ignorance had to be a component of man so that God could study and know itself. That's why Adam was kicked out of the garden and Eve stayed. Adam had to leave perfection That's why you, as melanated people, had to leave the perfected state of instantaneous manifestation, which was one of the gifts of melanin, of instantaneous disappearing and reappearing, which was one of the gifts of melanin. We abused it. The prototype to melanin, in other words, was ideation. The prototype of melanin is ideation. Doesn't come from any sources, any vitamins, any proteins that they're going to study. Ideation created melanin. The very intent of the One Most High created melanin. You cannot study that. The only way is to be that. The prototype to melanin was ideation, and the framework that distinguishes it as a singularity apart from the all in all. This ideation, by its very opposition to the one, created a shell that encapsulated the idea or the intent. This first encapsulation was the boundary or framework that polarized chaos into an order that dictated instructions to the realms of matter. Melanin is the connecting point, the nerve system, the electrical conduits created for the transposition of consciousness. The eternal realm has no shadow outside of it because there is no outside. Understand now how the shadow was created and why the darkness and melanin. That is what we represent as the all in all and the absolute. And if that's the case, then you have to understand that if there is a realm of all light, that means that there is no shadow within. Obviously, all knowledge does not have a distinct opposite, because the shadow or anything reflected inside of it would mean that there was a duplicity. The absolute one day, however, and this has got to be story form because we could never contemplate the absolute's mind. We could only be that and then try to understand it. But in the story, we could say that the absolute one day perceived of an outside to itself, which was perceived as darkness because it did not recognize that. From this perception, a force was awakened in the darkness. You have absolute light over eternity, or the eternal realm. From the perception that the One Most High, the first melanite, a force from that perception was awakened in the darkness. It perceived itself as something other than itself, and that perception distinguished itself from the one. The framework for that perception, that perceived distinction, that individualization, encapsulated the darkness, seeded it, and became the solution of mind that dimensionally manifests as the organizational intelligence science calls melanin. Let me say that again. Don't lose me. The framework for that perceived distinction, I'm taking you right back to God's mind. Your mind. The mind that created this madness, that encapsulated and invaginated chaos. The framework for that perceived distinction, that individualization, encapsulated the darkness, seeded it, and became the solution of mind that dimensionally manifests as the organizational intelligence science calls melanin. So anything that frames light into an individuate consciousness and intelligence must be considered melanin. Let me tell you that again, brothers and sisters. Anything that frames light or organizes individuate intelligence must be considered melanin. What is this definition we keep giving to it? The earliest form of humanity was ethereal, semi-substantive, with very little physicalized three-dimensional material in it. Check? We had organs that represented the frequencies of the dimensions we occupied. The etheric framework, as subtle and as non-substantial as it was, still represented the organization of form. Are you with me? Listen to what I'm saying to you, brothers and sisters. When were before this. The etheric framework, the non-substantial, that had the ideation encapsulated in this gossamer entity that we call the ethereal beings, living in a whole other property of awareness. The very organizational factor to that entity being had to be melanin. To perceive of itself, this thing to perceive of itself on any level or dimension of existence, corporeal or incorporeal, there had to be a framework, a border, a threshold of distinction based on the organization of substance around this form. We keep talking about the fact that we were spirits flying around, and spirit is melanin. It would have to be organized if there is a corporeal body that is incorporeal, and it has organizational properties. Then the outline, the frame that gives substantive thresholds to this entity has to be organized of another property of melanin. Because for you to have form and to be substantiated, you have to organize that which is into the property of individuate intelligence. Thus, the spirit forms and etheric forms were melanated creatures. Even if they were exuding light in different colors. Again, to perceive of itself, this entity on any level of dimension of existence, corporeal or incorporeal, there had to be a framework, a border.
Say again?
The paper.
Oh.
There had to be a border or threshold of distinction based on the organization of substance around the form. Therefore, there was and still is in existence a proto-melanin. Again, a proto-melanin or a etheric melanin that is the archetype to the DNA chromosomal molecular organizational intelligence that we identify as the pigment melanin. Think again. Go back to what I just said. There has to be a proto-melanin or an etheric melanin that is the archetype to the DNA chromosomal molecular organizational intelligence that we here identify today as melanin. What is that thing? What is that thing that can go through walls? What is that thing that can organize molecular structure so that it can decorporealize, it can change, it can organize depending on the materials around it, depending on the consciousness that's motivating it, depending on the intent that frames it. So what am I telling you? I'm telling you that your melanin is the escape hatch. Your melanin is the back door. Your melanin is the ticket out of this dimensional threshold. Your melanin is the key out of light code lockdown. Etheric man was a non-sexual and possessed, was non-sexual and possessed one light processing instrument. At the beginning of your reality, you only had one eye. You had no distinct features. You glowed with perception. You saw based on feelings. You saw based upon knowing, not the two eyes that you now function with. These two eyes are the representations of what it is that matter is, the yin and the yang, the this and the that, the duality. In the realm of illusion and duality, polarity demanded, listen carefully, polarity demanded that melanin design the body temple to process both light and darkness, as God, by its perception of itself as a distinction from itself, created both. Let me give it to you again. In the realm of illusion and duality, which we now occupy so happily, so blissfully, stupidly ignorant. In the realm of illusion and duality, polarity, once you start going down into matter, that which is the undiffusible light begins to spiral. And you can look at some good work by Drunvalo Melchizedek when he speaks about the flower of life. And he speaks to what your ancient Kemetic because that's who he studied to get this from. Understand that as light begins to diffuse, or it begins to have singularity of purpose, because light only becomes singular only after intent has been formed. And there are entities that live, higher beings that travel in creation with the ability to cast forth intent. Some are locked into the Father, Mother, Merkaba creations. Others are not, as they told you in the Keys of Enoch, another book that was sponsored by Rockefeller. As you begin to go into this, you begin to see that as the spiral, as you go deeper into ultramatter, the spiral becomes larger. So as you get from a point, which is essentially all of what it is that you see creation, when you see that as the sun, I told you that the sun is essentially the youngest creation in existence. And as such, it is a codification of the intent for that particular galaxy. There are many different suns that triangulate certain and become relay stations for certain consciousness vectors, so that they pick up and relay information to the different solar systems. That is why you are here with a solar system inside here to match by affinity the solar harmonics of each one of the planets that go around your programming, the programming you call your sun. The harmonics set up is what's setting up the dynamics of you now listening to me. Where after 20 years, if I said this 20 years ago, you wouldn't know what the fuck I was talking about. From this point, as intent begins to make its journey to find itself, it goes to this point here, and then establishes itself according to the borders of its own realization. And from that point, it begins to cycle again, creating another circle. And the same thing happens to another circle until it's got this. And from this particular Merkaba vortex, this seed of life, comes the tree of life and the flower of life. And as we begin to spiral downward deeper into matter, it gets slower and slower. And therefore the illusion of duality takes place. Because now you're setting up the distinctions. You think there's a distinction, but you're traveling all in one spiral. You're just going so damn slow, you think that this is that and that is this. But it's all one. So darkness, or dark matter consciousness, was created by the perception of distinction. The first eye became the central eye of equilibrium as it sits midway between the two hemispheres of the brain. Is that a coincidence? No. The two hemispheres of the brain are essentially balancing modalities to maintain your existence here in duality. Because you're not a duality creature. You have to resist. Matter sets up a resistance to the call of the one. If you did not have the inbred resistance or stubbornness, matter could not exist. Lucifer could not invaginate the ignorance. And you all came across an ignorant fool, don't listen, stubborn? Well, that's who man is. And again, sisters, I don't say man as man the sex, man as the prototype. Mother, father, son. Mem, alf, nun. Now the first eye became the central eye. I don't call it the third eye. It's the first eye. The first eye became the central eye of equilibrium. It's the eye that brings both hemispheres back into balance. And why is it centered, or at least central, in the brain? It's not coincidence. The first eye has a roof of blackness, a microcosmic representation of stars and galaxies in the supermelanated corpus callosum. You are already in contact with the High Father that they speak about in the Bible. The High Father is the cerebrum. Everything that is the Father, Mother, God is you, beloved. You don't got to go to church to try to find Jesus. You ain't got to find out a motherfucker. You can find everything in your head, in your body, in the nerves, and everything that the design plan put down for you to study. So the first eye has a roof of blackness, a microcosmic representation of the stars and galaxies in the supermelanated corpus callosum, the dark matter bridge that transduces the light codes of unity into the instructions that communicate synchronicity through the balanced operation of both hemispheres of the brain. So what you have inside and the different convolutions of the brain, and you will notice that the brain is now, they're studying the brains of children and they have extra convolutions. Why? Because we are being moved. The whole solar system is not staying one place. We are projecting. We are being thrown into the chaos. And there's no mothership coming to take you in a damn place. This is the mothership. The mothership is moving. We are being positioned, moved into a whole new consciousness delineation or alignment in the hologram. In this holographic matrix that we're in, we are being moved to become respatiated to other consciousness that are seeking the same shit we are. Don't be worried about no bastard coming down in a ship. The hell you want to get into something that somebody needs to get into to travel? The greatest civilizations in all existence have no technology. That's why your ancestors abandoned the shit. Because to move from one dimension to the next, you cannot have artificial shit. They won't exist where you're going. So when your ancestors made the jump to light speed, some of them who stayed back to maintain the pain registration of this particular planet, that's why we're persecuted, brothers and sisters. Your ancestors went forward and some stayed back to deal with the suffering this planet had to go through to make its next jump to light speed. If you wouldn't exist, this whole fucking planet would have been blown up already. If you didn't transduce the crazy shit that this white people are doing through your corporeal matrix, through your consciousness, through your empathy, if you didn't absorb that shit, the atomic bombs and all this crap, this fucking thing would have blown up a long time ago. That's who you are. And that's why your place on the throne next to the High Father is waiting for you. Balanced use of light is essential to the evolution of this present species envelope.